Let's start with the quote for today. You should be looking at our Strange New World Week 2. It's up to you and it's up to me. No one can say what we get to be. So why don't we rewrite the stars? Now, I apologize if that song, like it is for me right now, will be running through your head. It's from that really entertaining movie, The Greatest Showman. We'll come back to that at the end. First order of service, I want to clean up some confusion. So notice, let me just state this clearly, and I'll state it as often as I need to. The EFCA, our denomination, Evangelical Free Church of America, where I was just at our district conference this week, along with your elders here, I'm one of them, we're committed to a biblical definition of gender, sexuality, and marriage. Full stop. Okay, so that's not up for debate here. That's not why we're here. 2, we're committed to sharing the gospel with every person in the greater Thief River Falls area, which will include people who identify as LGBTQ+. Like it or not, friends, it's here. Men and women and young children are struggling with this, and because the internet is right in your back pocket, so you're not getting away from it. You can't move anywhere without getting away from it. So 3, therefore, it is necessary for us to understand the mission field we live in, so we may cultivate followers of Christ among all people. So that's why we're teaching a hard class. Again, we're committed to biblical gender, sexuality, marriage. We're committed to sharing the gospel with everybody. And therefore, you got to understand your mission field. And like it or not, it's here. Review. If you missed last week, we have this videotaped. It's not online live streaming, but you can go back, and I'll double check with Aaron where's the best place to find it on our website. But it should be up there. You'll be able to go back and review or catch up. And as I said last week, boy, if you have questions, pull me aside. Send me an email. If you got my cell phone, drop me a text. When Nathan teaches, he'd say the same thing. So let's talk. Let's learn together. A review from last week, knowing that we have some first-timers today. We needed to lay out some key terms, and I apologize, a little boring, but we need to lay out kind of what's going on, kind of the base, if you will. So notice, a modern self. Last week we talked about how this is more than just, hi, my name's Kevin, I was born in Chicago, Illinois, musician by trade, pastor by calling and choice. It's more than that. The view of who you are now has become something, notice, that has deeply rooted in your inner feelings. So how do I feel? 2, I've got to be able to express it. I have to be able to express who I believe I am. 3, there's this wrestling with authenticity. When I've been raised to believe one thing, but my feelings are going a different direction, I feel really, really torn. That's more common now than it was 10, 20, 50 years ago. The need to be authentic. And finally, social acceptance. So nowadays, in the 80s and 90s, we probably, many of us here got sick of tolerant language, right? Nowadays, it's not enough to be tolerant. You know, Doug and I can disagree on football, whatever. Okay, he makes fun of me as a Bears fan, right? But but there's no denying the 85 team. Never mind. Okay, but it, you know, in this day and age, I have to uphold what Doug believes. I have to accept it. So we've gone a next step. It's no longer enough to just be tolerant of differing views. We have to accept. We have to embrace them. That's the pressure we see throughout the media all the time now, if you're paying attention. So, and it's in the West here. And then by the West, I mean in North America, Western Europe primarily. All right, next, expressive individualism. Defined simply as every person has a unique feeling and personal intuition and should be able to express that. In fact, needs to express it if you are to be a truly, fully realized person. So in other words, you've got to express yourself. And the individual is more and more and more important than ever. Nathan and I were just talking about this. So the author of the book, which is noted at the bottom of your page, is from England. And he was asked in a lecture that Nathan was listening to, why doesn't this seem as prevalent in the UK as it does here? And he says, well, I think it's because he's an American citizen now, I believe. It's because we're just so much more individual. It's a part of our DNA. We have that one unique thing that Europe never had, the Wild West. You got to go out there and you got to survive on your own. It's the John Wayne American mentality. You got an idea, you can do it, pull your bootstraps up, get her done. And don't tread on my lawn. Right? So his thought was the culture here was just ripe for this to really, really take hold. Our individualism can be a great strength and also can be a great weakness. Last review term from last week, again, as I hinted at this, we live in an age of authenticity. Each person, each self has a quest, and this is a theme of a lot of movies these days, isn't it? You've got to go discover who you are. Not what you were taught to be, maybe, not what society says you are, but you've got to go discover who you are uniquely. And often that is a narrative, that is a story that says, shed what mom and dad told you, don't listen to the church, right? You got to be authentic to yourself. So, and therefore you got to resist social conformity to faith, family, politics, society. Okay? Now, last week we opened up and I asked you to do a little exercise for me. And some of you who are new, don't panic. But I asked you, if I was a stranger, introduce yourself to me in 3 sentences. Now, I want to ask you, did any of you include your gender identity or sexual preference when you did that last week? Anybody? Warren did. Okay. All right. Why or why not?
It didn't seem particularly relevant.
Okay. Madeline says it didn't seem particularly relevant. Why else? Observation, what do you mean, Corey? Okay, so Corey says it's obvious to the naked eye that he's a man, based on the very handsome gray goatee. I appreciate that, Corey. Nathan does too. Why else? Why did it not even cross your mind to say I'm a heterosexual male, or I'm a heterosexual female, or I'm whatever?
Actually, a fairly minor part of my identity.
Madeline touches on a good point. It's a minor part of her identity. Do you feel the same way? Yeah? Okay. Have you noticed that that's no longer the case, and that's why we're teaching this class? If that's an aha moment, write it down. Something has shifted where my sexuality, my gender, my sexual preferences are not a minor part, but are now a majorly defining part of who I am. To say that we are an overly sexualized society is an understatement. Now, I'm a kid from the 80s. My wife and I are traveling in the 90s in Europe. We're touring with the choir. We started in London, took the boat over to France, and we're in Paris, and then ended up in Switzerland. And I remember in Paris, 2 things that remind me of what maybe I saw coming and is now here. One, I turned on the TV in Paris, and oh my goodness. It was pornographic in the 90s. I mean, it was like, whoa. I was a new believer. I'm like, well, that's going off. Not watching that. The next day, we're walking to Le Sacré-Cœur, this beautiful Sacred Heart Cathedral. It is a haul to get up there. I don't know if I could even do it. And we come down and we get lost, which is totally typical for me. If you've ever driven with me, I get lost like in the mall. I have no sense of direction. Like, I have to think which way is north. So, my buddy Dave, one of my best friends, we're walking, and Allison's with me. We weren't dating. Darn, I missed my chance for romance, didn't I, brothers? You hear me? Wow. But, that happened later. Anyhow, so we're walking down the streets of Paris, and my buddy Dave bumps into a woman in like 3-inch stilettos and fishnets, and she cusses him up and down the river. And I did a double take. I said, oh, Dave, that's a dude. That was a guy. You bumped into a transvestite. I think we're on the wrong side of town. Let's turn around. France back then was a much more sexualized country than we were then, but I think we've caught up and maybe surpassed them. So any other points as to why you didn't list your sexuality or your sexual preference on your identity? Dave? Okay, it's private. Yeah. Okay, that's a great point. Do we talk about our sexual activity? No, we don't do that, typically. It's not something we would ever share. There's something in our Christian faith and our roots that's taught us that that's a private matter, not a public one. All right. So let's talk about the new sexual revolution, point 3. So this isn't your 1960s variety hippie make love not war revolution. I need to be clear on that. Now, a lot of things changed in the 60s, and I wasn't there to observe them, but some of us were, not trying to insult you, but you're just older. So you saw the changes, casual sex. You saw some of these things. Woodstock tends to be the one that most people reference as kind of a sign, and other things. So, but we've come a little further down the line on this issue. Point B, modern sexual behavior has removed shame. That's your first answer if you're a writer. Shame and social stigma. Shame and social stigma concerning sexual acts. So the revolution in the 60s was still considered shameful by many, many people in our country. You know, it was a rebellious movement. It was on the fringe, quote unquote, and probably very much on the fringe here in Thief River. And there was a big social stigma that you had to overcome if you were going to be a freewheeling, sexually active teen or 20-year-old in that era. But that's been largely removed. There is much less shame, social shame, and the stigma that goes along with it. 3, sex is now largely considered moral or immoral based really on one thing, and that's consent. It's consent. So you are sexually active with whomever, whatever gender, or both, and it is immoral or moral, it's right or wrong, essentially if that other person has agreed. Otherwise, it's called what? Rape. Now, why are these changes good or bad? What are you thinking? Why are these changes in our view and the practice of sex good or bad? What are you thinking?
The focus on the self.
The focus on the self.
This is an observation
Mm-hmm.
of 30 years of working with people. This whole thing about if it's consensual, it's okay, completely misses what actually happens to people. Because invariably, one person is invested in relationship.
Yeah.
The other person is invested in sex. So even if there's consent, it's still a mess. And it gets messier. So you see these relationships that get torn apart and people cheating on people. And it's all of this stuff misses how it actually plays out.
Very good.
This whole self stuff is nonsense.
Okay.
Nobody ever does anything totally as an individual, not even Descartes.
All right, good. So, speaking as a 3-decade professional therapist, you have sex, quote unquote, freely. It's not free. There's always fallout, isn't there? And some of us have experienced that. I came to Christ later in my life. I was sexually active. There's fallout, huge fallout. It's not free like the 60s promised. It's a total lie. But so we see that's definitely, we would say as Christians, a negative thing. What else comes to mind as you see the changes or the definition of sexuality, this revolution changing? Anything else? Any other thoughts?
We're reducing the distinction between humans and animals. God set us apart from the rest of the animals. Technically, we're animals, but God set us apart with morality and other emotional considerations, baggage, we call it sometimes. And these activities are trying to reduce that distinction.
Okay, so it's a little bit like what was that Isle of Moreau? What's that movie where they? It was disturbing. But okay, so you're saying we're really becoming like animals. Just whenever the hormones are going and the feelings are right, we're having sex with whatever seems right, and we are not honoring. And I'm going to put words in Chris's mouth, but we're made in the image of God, and it marks us as profoundly different, doesn't it, than the animals?
There's another irony in this whole thing.
The irony is,
I
yeah.
may say a lot, you may tell me to shut up.
Okay.
My permission to tell me to shut up.
Yes, ma'am.
What actually happens with all this, do whatever you want sexually, is that your actual, who you are as a person disappears. You become nothing more than your sensuality.
So
It destroys everything you are as an actual person.
So is it fair to re-summarize that or restate that, Madeline? When you give yourself over to a life of uncontrolled or no boundary sex, it just defines who you are. It becomes your whole personhood. It takes over.
And that's nothing.
And then you're nothing, yeah.
That makes sense why people would put it out there first as part of their identity.
Yeah. It is very self-defining, and then, as Madeline is pointing out, very incredibly self-destructing and reductionistic. But we're going to unpack that more. So I think we in general agree this is not a good thing. Is that right? Okay. Yeah, Sarah.
There's also physical consequences of disease and diseases that can cause cancer and
Yes.
infertility and lifelong that way as well.
Yeah, correct. So in the 80s, what was the epidemic that we saw? The AIDS epidemic, right? And yeah, STDs. Look at what's the retirement village in Florida? Is it called the Village? Yeah. There's 3 zip codes, and there's more herpes and other STDs there per population than anywhere else in the States, I think. And this is among 60s and 70-year-olds, by the way. They're swinging freely.
Can I play devil's advocate a little?
You can play the devil's advocate.
One of the things that I think could be a positive is recognizing that people experience the sense of, I'm attracted to people of my own gender. They have the experience of, I don't feel like I'm the gender that I was born with. If we don't recognize that, we are not going to reach them. If we just try to punish them, it's not going to fix it. And we have to understand where they are and accept that that's the reality of where they are if we're going to reach them.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean I'm saying accept that that's okay. I'm saying if I don't understand that's where you're coming from, then I'm not going to preach the word in a way that's going to make sense.
Sure. Well, that's a very, very good point. And we're going to build towards that in our time together, recognizing we may not like where we're at, but it is where we're at. And we need to be able to learn how to minister and love anybody. Right? I don't think the golden commandment says love your neighbor as yourself unless they're bisexual or homosexual or transgender. Don't think there's an asterisk there. So good point, Madeline. Let's keep moving. Why do we think the way we do? I think this is an awkward term, the social imaginary, but it captures the idea really well. So this is the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor. I'm going to read a quote and then you'll see the summary there. The quote goes like this. So he says, quote, I speak of imaginary, one, because I'm talking about the way ordinary people imagine their social surroundings. And this is often not expressed in theoretical terms. Rather, it's carried in images, stories, legends. So there's our first point, our social imaginary. How we as a people imagine ourselves in reality is not carried on descriptions or arguments. It's carried in stories and in songs and in movies and in commercials. 2, he says, it's also the case that our social imaginary is often, the theory of it is the possession of the academic, right? It's the possession of the professors. They understand why it is we do what we do. The rest of us, just kind of assume it. It's not really something we can describe theoretically. So the theory here is held by a few, but we as a whole share it. And last but not least, our social imaginary is what's commonly understood that makes it possible for you and I to have common practices, a shared sense of legitimacy. So let me give you an illustration. I love coffee. Anybody else? There we go. All right. So I take probably far too many coffee breaks. Esther could tell you. Okay. And I try to balance it out with water, but that's a different story. All right, so I go to the bathroom a lot if you wanted to know that. So I take coffee breaks at work, and I assume the science behind how coffee is made. The beans are ground and the steeping, but I don't think of that when I push the button and I drink the coffee. It's assumed. It's intuitive. And I walk through my door as opposed to trying to walk through the wall. Because I know intuitively that's not going to go well, right? So there are things in our lives and there are things in our culture that we assume it's on an intuitive level, but that we wouldn't even care to necessarily articulate. Gravity is one as well, right? We don't think about the laws of physics, and I'm sure a couple of our brothers here could tell us. But we know if I fall off my ladder, looking at somebody here, I might break something, right? We know that there are consequences, right? So that's how our social imagination works. I may not be able to articulate it point for point, but we're swimming in it. It's there. It's what we share. I want you to think creatively with me. What are some images, stories, legends that capture our American imagination? What are some images, stories, movies, songs? I mean, anything here creatively. What do you think captures the American ethos? Becky, you got one? Still thinking?
Horatio Alger,
What's that?
the whole Horatio Alger mythos.
Okay.
You can do anything you want if you just go for it. And it's basically capturing the whole individualism is Satan's biggest tool in this country.
Okay. So we have a cultural narrative that says you can do whatever you want. I think of the horrible story. I didn't bring it with me, but I read this some years ago. Parents had a daughter, I believe, who believed she could fly an airplane and wanted to do it, and they let her fly one to her death. She didn't know how to fly the airplane. Yeah, common sense, right? But but I can do whatever I want. I can be whatever I want. What are some other cultural narratives? What are some representations? Yeah. Bingo. Okay. Yeah. And these things aren't all bad, by the way. I mean, we have an incredible work ethic in our country. We still do compared to the rest of the world. And so I'm not saying just negatives here. So don't we think of the flag when we think of our great country? We think of the Statue of Liberty, don't we? We think of that in theory, anybody could come here and participate as a citizen and prosper. Think of how many of our grandparents or great-grandparents came here because this was their chance. Right? This was their chance. You weren't going to get land back in the old country, right? It used to be life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, by the way. That was the original saying until Jefferson changed it. Why? Because in the UK, even now, good luck getting property. You got to be loaded. So, what are some other parts of our American culture that you think of when you think American? Nathan? Superman, there we go.
Our military, too.
Military? Yeah.
Captain America.
Captain America. Yeah. My kids loved that stuff. I'm so tired of the Avengers, by the way. I'm just going to be honest.
Hey, the portrayal of Jesus.
Oh, there we go. Bob's stirring the pot here. All right. So yes, Jesus is a white European male. That's not true. Okay, just want to make sure. What else? I mean, think about, because again, these are the things that we assume that are kind of part of our shared view, our imagination of our country. Yep, Madeline?
The white view is very different than
Okay.
if you know well,
Yep.
black people, you'll hear some very different views of most of this stuff. They don't think Jesus is a Caucasian male.
Right. Yeah, true. So depending on your ethnicity, majority culture, minority culture, could be a very, very different tale, right? One of my kids, or a couple of my kids, really enjoy Jane Austen books and some of those movies. And I think back to that time period where it wasn't really great to be Irish. We were basically the English slaves. It's romantic and to talk about it. And again, Jane Austen is English. But I don't think I wanted to live through the potato famine. Oh, and by the way, that was partly caused because the English wouldn't share our potatoes that we gave them to them. So, yeah. So depending on where you were raised and what it was like, it could be a very different narrative. Okay. So we got the idea. We have a shared social imagination. Like it or leave it, it's there. There's a lot of good and there's some bad. And that's the way it is in every culture. That's how every missionary approaches their mission field. Hey, let's look at what are the shared beliefs, and let's put them next to the scriptures and say, okay, that's really good. That's not so good. And then you begin your work. Let me pause. I've been going at a frantic pace. Any questions so far? All right. I don't know you well enough to whether to pause for 2 minutes and kind of hold out for the Norwegian who's going, I don't know if I want to say this out loud. So I want you to know I'm not your boss. I am your pastor, but I'm a brother, and this is a class to learn in together. So there are no, wrong questions. quote unquote. Okay, so we'll keep moving because we do have some work to do. As I promised, I don't want this to be fully lecture. I want it to be interactive. I'm going to get a start on the Romantics. Started on the Romantics, and Nathan's going to finish it up. So we're going to cover Augustine and René Descartes. Okay, two people you may or may not have heard of, but they've had an impact on the world. So Augustine, what an incredibly fascinating man. A bishop in Hippo of Africa, so probably one of our first black Christians, if you think of it that way, at least as far as skin color goes. Augustine's story is one of being raised loosely in the church. His mother was a devout Christian, but boy, he liked sex too much, and so couldn't stop fooling around. And he is the first man in history, the first person in history to write an autobiography, and it's called The Confessions. I've read parts of it. It is fascinating. If the first autobiography written in 400 AD, pretty cool. And in part of that Confessions is his conversion story. Is a conversion story where he hears scripture and is converted. He's a changed man. It's been said that Augustine is the most quoted church father, and by church father I mean think old pastor, okay, in the early church, by the Reformation, the Reformers. Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, they all quoted Augustine because he was really, really solid on grace in the Bible. But another scholar pointed out that maybe the reason for the Reformation is because Augustine also had a very Roman Catholic view of the church, and those two things were quite at odds together. So it's been said, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, that the Reformation was essentially Augustine's view of grace and his view of the church at war with each other. But he writes in his autobiography that God, and it's assumed in every part, that God is at the center of Augustine's life, from birth to death. So even while Augustine is living in sin, sleeping around, having kids out of wedlock, stuff that he knew wasn't right, and his mama he knew was right, God was still working on Augustine. God was at the center of Augustine's universe. And it's probably why his confessions are so compelling and his testimony was so. Move to René Descartes. Cogito ergo sum, or I think, therefore I am. Right? Okay, we got 1,200 years later. And you have a French thinker, mathematician as well, who decides to doubt everything except the existence of himself, the doubter. He wants to reason to God from himself. And that's a major change. Up until this point, philosophers always started, God is at the center, God's the foundation, and then you move from there. Makes sense to us as Christians. Many of us view our world that way. There was God, then there was us, and that's the right order. And I don't know if Descartes had any ill intentions here, but he starts with man, and whether intentionally or not, puts man kind of at the center of everything. I think, therefore I am. Now, it is a circular reasoning. The result is assumed in the subject, so to speak, but it shifts. And I was just reading a couple months ago a history of philosophy, and he's kind of considered the granddaddy of modern philosophy. You start with yourself, and then you try to figure out how the world operates. Okay, we have René Descartes, a Christian by confession, as the start of this. Human thought, now, this is where our author, I think, makes an interesting insight. Whether intentional or not, Descartes brings human thought, more particularly the psychological self, into the center. So think of the shift. Well, back in Descartes' day, you could have been a very early Protestant, I suppose, but you're probably a Catholic. Most of the world was, and that was a small c Catholic, really, that's what everybody was. And God's the center of the universe. You see it in the church when you walk in, you hear it in the songs in Latin. And here's this philosopher saying, no, maybe we are the center. Maybe we and our thoughts and our feelings, if you extrapolate, become the center of everything. It's a huge shift. It's a huge shift. Then comes the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation and this crazy monk named Luther, who's simply just protesting how Rome is making money off of indulgences to build St. Peter's Basilica. So if you ever go see Michelangelo's beautiful ceiling that he painted, that was largely funded through people who thought they were paying the church to get their relatives out of hell sooner or out of purgatory sooner. So Luther was pretty upset about this, had no intention of starting a revolution. But a lot of things came into play. including the idea that maybe I have some meaning. Maybe I am a little more central to the world than I thought before. And the printing press and all sorts of things. I'll get there. Hold on a sec. So Descartes, without perhaps meaning to, causes a lot of trouble, but also kind of plants some seeds that get watered and grow into something quite unexpected. Yeah, Madeline.
Even Michelangelo was. Have you ever looked closely at that scene where God is reaching out?
Okay.
If you look at it carefully, the part where God is shaped like a human brain. If you look at it, it's very obvious.
Interesting.
And it's clearly intentional.
Interesting.
So already, even Michelangelo is already. I think there was the church had taken over, so nobody had any individualism at all. So now we're starting to move the other way.
Yeah, yeah.
So the Renaissance started focusing on individualism.
For sure. Yep.
And so
Yeah.
go.
So if you missed that, she's saying even if you look at the Sistine Chapel, you can see kind of, to use the bigger term, humanism coming in, this more man-centered idea. It's hard for us to understand this as Americans. This is where we are really blinded by our heritage. And again, not right or wrong, just is. Anybody been to Asia? Okay. Would you describe Asians as individualistic as we are? No, much more society-focused, much more team-focused. You see it in sports. You see it in sports a lot. I love baseball. The World Baseball Classic was classic. Am I surprised that Japan got to the very end and won it? No. They play incredibly well as a team. Team comes first, self comes second. And honor, shame, and there's a lot more to unpack there. All I'm saying is we have a little bit of a blind spot here because we're so individualistic that we can't see how somebody would think differently. But historically, apparently, our ancestors really, really did. So why bring this up? We're moving on to romanticism, and I don't just mean rom-coms and those horrible movies they put on in Christmas. What are they called? Hallmark. How did you know that, Kim? No, I'm kidding. He loves his wife. Yes, brothers. Some brothers in here too. Yes. I can't stand those movies, but it's okay. Watch them. Whatever you do. They're so predictable. But anyhow, you just wear a flannel and okay, anyhow. So I love to pick on those partly too because Pastor Kent likes them. But anyhow, so we're not just talking about romanticism in that sense. And I am a sucker for a romantic movie and definitely a romantic song. But we're talking about a movement of the way we view the world and ourselves. And the trending here is more towards individual self-centeredness, to be frank. So I'm going to give Nathan the enviable task of finishing this off with Rousseau, who is really the granddaddy of the French Revolution and really influential for ours, but also was a very dangerous thinker. All right, last but not least, our application time here. Back of the page, why can't we follow our hearts and rewrite the stars? So, full confession, I loved the movie The Greatest Showman. If you haven't watched it, it's a great film. Tons of fun. I sing the songs a lot. It's really a fascinating movie. If you don't know it, it's about Barnum and Bailey and the whole circus thing, right? P.T. Barnum. Now, it is guilty of a couple things. It's guilty of what we call a subtraction story. This is the idea where you tell a very linear story as if anyone's life is as straight as a line. And you just went from point A to point B, and there wasn't any of this. Okay, so there's definitely some of that in the movie. Okay, P.T. Barnum probably did take advantage of these men and women who were, by cultural standards, weird. The bearded lady, the midgets, with whatever you just insert. Okay, so it's got a lot of our American ethos in it. You know, this is a guy rags to riches. He had an idea and he got it done. It's pretty incredible. There are songs in here, though, that disturb me. One of them is Rewrite the Stars. Now, the context here is it's a white male and a non-white female. And in those days, it was illegal in several places for biracial marriages. That was considered by many Christians to be sin. I have relatives who believed that. So the song in the context, in its immediate context, is we want to rewrite this. We want to be able to have a relationship, whether no matter what our skin color says and society says. So that part, that's awesome. I get it. The danger is how it could be taken to mean literally rewrite the stars, as if we could rewrite what God has put in motion. So let's unpack a little bit facts, faith, feeling. Anyone familiar with that illustration from the old Campus Crusade for Christ pamphlets, or what is now called Cru? I don't think I need to use the whiteboard, but imagine a train. And at the beginning of the train, you've got the engine, and that's facts. Following facts is faith, because faith is always rooted in an object. Faith is rooted in something concrete, right? You have faith that chair will support your weight, right? And you act on it, and that's your feeling, right? So that the chair is the fact, the faith is your belief, and then the feeling or the action is when you put your butt in it and it supported you, right? Now, this was really helpful for me as an artist coming to Christ in my late teens, early 20s. A high feeler. I took the Myers-Briggs, and I'm a feeler. I feel first, think second. I needed to be reminded, whoa, Kevin, if you're not feeling like you're a Christian right now, that doesn't replace the facts. And that doesn't replace what my faith is rooted in. It's not rooted in my feeling, it's rooted in the facts. Jesus loved me and died for me. And I've been needing to hear that for 20 plus years, because if I'm not careful, my feelings, because I am a romantic at heart, my feelings really start driving the caboose in a way that can be dangerous. Now, this isn't to say that any one of these three is not important. Oh, they're all important, right? The facts are irrevocable. You need the facts to be a Christian. You need to believe that Jesus was the Son of God, is the Son of God, risen from the dead, right? Paid for sins, the gospel. We need faith. We have to believe in it. Our God is not a universalist in the sense that he doesn't just save everybody. No, we have a responsibility, don't we, to believe. And it must enter into the heart, our feelings. It's very, very valid. We need to feel the good news of the gospel. The heart is talked about often in the scriptures. And remember what it usually represents is your guts. In the Old Testament, they don't talk about the heart at all. They talk about your intestines. They talk about what your gut and the deer and pulling out, okay, the entrails, because that's what you really feel. But the idea, of course, with the metaphor, is it's your innermost person. It's the center of who you are and your thoughts and your feelings and what you will act from. So fact, faith, feelings, extremely important. And I don't want us in this endeavor to understand cultural trends to downplay feelings. They're extremely important, right? Now, what does the Bible teach us about the human heart? This is where I want some of your thoughts. Chris? All right. Chris is starting out with an encouraging comment that the heart is the most wicked of all things. Deceitfully wicked, Corey says in quoting from Jeremiah. Thank you. Yes. So the heart is deceitfully wicked. That's not part of our cultural narrative, is it? It's not, is it?
It is if you're a Christian.
It is if you're a Christian, yes. But not in our broader culture, is it? Follow your heart. How many times have you heard that? Follow your heart. And now as a pastor, I go, I cringe. If you're sitting before me and, Pastor, I just really want to do this and I'm following my heart. And I go, whoa, hold on. And we'll do fact, faith, feeling, and we'll talk about, a lot of things. What else does the Bible teach us about the heart? I've already said some things. Think positively. Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. So the heart is the center of our personhood, isn't it? We are to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. Anything else you think of that the scriptures teach us about the heart, about that?
He talks about writing it on our heart, writing his word on our heart.
It was Jeremiah, I believe, right? Or Ezekiel, one of the two, right? One of them describes the heart as dead and as stone, and that God takes our heart when we are converted and makes it soft. And I love the illustration. I didn't come up with this, but when we think about being born again, we think of John and Jesus talked with Nicodemus. The illustration was brought to me. We're not we're not drowning. We are actually dead at the bottom of a deep lake. That's our heart. It's dead. It's stone. It's not living. And God brings us up. And when he converts us, he makes what was dead now alive. That's I think a great illustration of what God does in conversion. Before I was converted at 18, I just wanted all the wrong things. My heart wanted no part in God. In fact, I tried to keep pushing him away. I want to do what I want to do. My feelings tell me, right? But then he converted me, and I know what's wrong, and I have freedom to now choose the right. You too, right? Why can't we rewrite the stars is our last question.
We didn't invent them.
Okay, Madeline says we didn't invent them. Who did? Madeline, you can't answer this. God did. Yeah, absolutely. Now, that's not a commonly held view, is it? At least outside the church, is it? Right? We have no longer really Darwinian evolution. It's advanced beyond that, but we have evolutionary theory, which says that it was really a random act. Right? So, we can't rewrite the stars because God, the Creator, made them. We can't rewrite the stars because God, the Creator, created them for good. Think about the implications of that for your life. When God created you, not only did he say it was good, when he created Adam and Eve, he said it was very good. And we could extrapolate into all sorts of things here, right? This means that evil is not the opposite, quote unquote, of good. It is the perversion of good. We don't live in a yin-yang reality. Star Wars is lying. Star Wars is wrong. Evil is the perversion of good, right? This is why Paul says to the Corinthians, who had, if we think our society was wicked, the Corinthians were right there competing, sexually speaking, and the husbands and wives were so grossed out by all the stuff they saw, they didn't want to have sex anymore, to be candid. And Paul says, no, it's what it's made for. It's good. It's okay. Don't deprive one another. In fact, your bodies are not your own. So we can't rewrite the stars because God made them. God's good, and it reflects his intention. And it gives us a message. This is where we're going to be going more and more each week. It gives us a message that brings hope to a world that desperately needs it. But we're going to have to probably do some pre-evangelism. Okay, and now what I mean by that is, Chris is an engineer. I'm a musician. Chris is a musician too, okay? But he uses both parts of his brain in a way I can only use one part, okay? So I had a chance to kind of get into Chris's world a little bit, and I had to ask him a lot of very basic questions because I don't understand how this stuff works, right? He had to build a vocabulary that we could share. Okay, he had to build a vocabulary that we can share. Part of our labors in cultivating followers for Christ in our community and our world is building a vocabulary that we can share, right? And identifying the areas where, we'll just say Susie, to use a random name, who views herself as a him or whatever her current view on her gender is. We have to realize there's some incredible needs there, insecurities, and false hopes that we can gently address with the hope of a creator, with the hope of a savior. But we've got to build some vocabulary. We've got to create some shared ideas and begin to be able to discuss it. If we're not willing, well, there's no chance for that person to be evangelized or to have hope through us at least. We have to remember too, of course, the enemy is not the man, the woman, or the child. The enemy is, of course, the devil. He's the one who wants to destroy. He's the one who wants to destroy. My friends in college who were gay or lesbian, bisexual. So let's remember who our enemy is, the devil. And with that, let me close us in prayer. Lord, hard subjects for sure these weeks. I'm thankful for the men and women here who want to grow in understanding our world a little better. so that they can be evangelists, witnesses to the gospel, to the lost and the dying. And Lord, I know that there are some of us here who have kids or grandkids, nieces or nephews who are struggling with their gender identity, with their sexual behaviors. And it just grieves our hearts. Oh, give us your heart, Jesus, to weep over Jerusalem and to pray. And give us hearts like our Lord, Jesus, like you had, to love and to speak the truth with love. So we ask you for this blessing and for you to be glorified in our lives today and throughout this upcoming Easter weekend as well. In your name we pray. Amen.